All right, everybody, what is going on? This has been a highly requested video from me for a while, so I wanted to go ahead and get this into a video. It's a little bit slow in Dokkan, and there's just not much I actually want to cover in-game at the moment. You know, here in about a week, whenever the Super Saiyan 2 EZAs drop, I will go ahead and get around to covering them. But until then, I did want to get a guide out for you guys to learn and start figuring out how to calculate defense on your own. Again, this has been a highly requested topic from me. I'm pretty sure there are guides out there already for how to do this, and I can't promise you that my guide is going to be the, absolute definitive, 100% correct, best guide to go off of, but I just wanted to kind of walk you guys through maybe the tips and terms and the process that has helped me learn how to calculate units. A lot of it for me was trial and error, talking to other people who knew what they were doing, and just, figuring this all out a little bit on my own, a little bit through trial and error, a little bit through asking other people for help. So, I feel like the best way you learn something is just doing it over and over and then teaching it to other people as well. So that's kind of what I'm doing right here. Again, I'm sorry, I'm taking a minute to kind of preface what exactly we're going to go over here, but I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. So the first thing that I want to start out with here is just some base vocabulary. I think before you learn anything, whether it's a new subject, whether it is even like math, like history, as you guys go through school, I think a good chunk of my audience is either late in high school or maybe early college. What you guys will learn as you start going throughout, figuring out what you want to do with the rest of your life, right, is that it's all about learning vocabulary. Even if you're going to be like an electrician, or if you're going to be a plumber, or if you're going to be an accountant, if you're going to be a lawyer, if you're going to be a teacher, if you're going to be, I don't know, an astronaut, anything like that, it all starts with learning the language of the job that you want to be. That way you're not clueless whenever people start talking to you. So that's kind of what I want to start out with here, is just going over some basic, I'm going to call it basic vocabulary, but just some terms that I'm going to use throughout the video. That way you guys know what I'm talking about, you understand everything, and you can come back to this part of the video, reference it if there's maybe a word or topic you don't understand. And if there's one that's not in the vocabulary list that I use later on in the slides, please let me know. I'll be happy to try to explain in the comments below. So without further ado, again, it's already 2.5 minutes in and I'm still in the title slide. People are already mad. They're telling me that I'm long-winded. It's all good. We're going to move on to the next slide now. So the first set of basic vocabulary, again, I'm trying to break this down to, maybe you're just now learning about Dokkan, you don't know what anybody's talking about, so I just wanted to kind of break this down into like the bare basics that we want to talk about here. So the first thing that we want to talk about is a unit's defense stat. This is the amount of defense that a unit has. Typically, if you were to go look at a unit on like Dokkan Info or in-game, you'll be able to see the card, and it'll have like, the card out right here, and it'll have like your 3 numbers, right? I know, again, this is very basic, but the defense stat is the starting point for calculating defense, so we need everyone to know what we're talking about whenever we're looking at that. If you're looking at a website like Dokkan Info, they have it right down here, so you go to defense. For example, if your unit was 100% in the hidden potential system, then Vegeta's would be 14,060, right? So just so that we familiarize ourselves with what I'm talking about, the defense stat, the base defense stat of a unit is just the amount of defense that they have before anything else is considered. As soon as we get those details out and they drop that card, we know what their defense is, right? That is the base starting point for what we're talking about, all right? So the next thing we're going to talk about is the leader skill buff. This is the combined percentage increase a unit receives for being on a specific team. So typically leader skill buffs these days are based around being on a category. For example, again, if we go back to this Vegeta right here, it even says, leader skill. Whenever we get the card arts in game as well, it says leader skill. Whenever they post it on Twitter, it's like, this is the leader skill. This is what it's called. This is what it's talking about. If you're unsure, if you look at your card, it's typically right below the defense stat, or it's like the first line at the top, and it tells you, okay, Super Saiyan 2 characters or Resurrected Warrior characters, not both. either or, get key 3, HP attack and defense plus 170% for this Vegeta, for example. So whenever people talk about leader skills, this is what they're talking about. Every team is going to have 2 leaders, so their combined percentages, assuming that your characters are on both, which they typically should be, because generally you're going to be running the same character as your leader, right? That right there is going to be your leader skill buff. So, for example, if you're running 2 of this Vegeta, you would have 170. You'd have another 170 from the other one. Combined, that's 340%. The next word that we're looking at here are links. Again, very basic. Oh, wrong thing. We're clicking around. There we go. So right here, link skills. These are additional buffs that characters receive. What did I say? Sorry, additional increases a unit receives for being next to a similar character or similar characters that can be leveled up from level 1 to 10, gradually increasing the potency of the buffs. So just for example, I keep clicking on the wrong screen. This Vegeta right here has Saiyan Warrior Race. You can see at link level 1, it gives him a 5% attack boost. At level 10, it gives him 10%. Another good example is Prepared for Battle. At level 1, it gives him 2 key. At level 10, it gives him 2 key, 5% attack and defense. So these are additional buffs that a unit receives. Again, I said similar characters or characters. If you're ever unsure if a character links well together, again, a unit or a website like Dokkan Info is a great source for you. You can see characters that share 6 links with this Vegeta, how many categories they share, and then all the different characters that you can obtain that share links with this Vegeta. And again, as you would expect, you know, like I said with similar characters, these Vegeta characters are, you know, all we have here, right? Vegeta is working well with other Vegetas. Or, for example, this Buu Saga Goku, right? But for the most part, it's just other Vegetas. They're going to be sharing links. So that's what we're getting at there. The next thing is a passive skill. This is the main abilities of a character. Typically, this is the heart and soul of a unit's kit and mostly determines a unit's performance. Again, these things are all labeled. If I'll stop clicking on that tab, I should probably close it. But you can see right here, it is labeled as a passive skill. Again, these things are all spelled out for you in game. So if you're ever confused, you know, just learn the different aspects of the game. You know, this is like step 1 of learn how to click on your units, learn how to read a card. That's not really what this guide is for, but you know, we have a section that's called the passive skill, and this is going to list out generally the main abilities, everything that a character is doing, or at least the, you know, the general like 90% of what a unit is doing is coming out of their passive skill. You know, they may have a super attack effect, they may have like an active skill or something like that, a domain, but for the, well, even domains come out of the passive now, so, but regardless, most of what a character is doing is coming out of their passive skill. That's where you see this big paragraph of information, and you know, it's got a title, all that good stuff. So that's what a passive skill is. The next thing I want to talk about is passive phase 1. This is typically known as or referred to in the community as your start of turn buffs or start of turn increases by the community. These are increases a unit receives in their passive, generally speaking, and we'll go over this later, when no other action is taken by the unit. So we'll get into that later, exactly what that means. I'll kind of point some of these out to you guys. But just know that generally, if you're reading a unit's kit and it just seems like you don't have to do anything to get this buff, that's typically, generally, sometimes the buffs that characters are getting. Typically, the passive phase 1 and phase 2 are the hardest parts of doing calcs, knowing which buffs go into passive phase 1, which buffs go into passive phase 2. Once you can kind of wrap your head around that and get a general sense and feel for it, that's where you can start to really take off and learn, okay, I like you build confidence, you're like, all right, I know how calcs work now. This is typically the biggest barrier, the biggest hurdle most people face whenever they start learning how to calc things, so Just wanted to get that terminology out here. And then passive phase 2, this is typically known as your multiplicative increases by the community. So anytime it says like, oh, that's a multiplicative buff, this is a multiplicative buff. Oh, they get this on super attack, that's a multiplicative buff, right? So these are increases a unit receives in their passive generally when an action is taken by the unit. So I just kind of put examples of like dodging, attacking, guarding, different things like that. So that's going to be your plus 70% defense after dodging or something like that. So typically, in order to activate your passive phase 2 parts of your passive, you're going to need to take some sort of action. So that's what I wanted to get out of there. A few more terms that we need to go over. The super attack effect phase. So this is the increase a character receives when performing a super attack, not to be confused with the on super attack buffs received in passive phase 2. This is tied directly to the part of a unit's kit called a super attack. Again, if we go back to Vegeta, you can see right here, this is the super attack. So right here, this raises attack and defense for 1 turn. This is his super attack effect buff. Again, not to be confused with passive phase 2, for example, this one right here, attack and defense plus 120% when attacking, right? Don't confuse these two. This is different. So this is an on super attack effect. This is its own phase. This is its own thing. There are many buffs that can activate in your passive that say on super attack. Those are completely separate things. So that's why I want to kind of get that imagery inside your head of, we got passive phase 1, kind of imagine that as its own bucket. We've got passive phase 2, imagine that as its own bucket. And then super attack effects, imagine that as its own bucket as well. So in total, kind of the buckets that I've introduced to you guys is we've got the defense stat bucket. We've got the leader skill bucket. We've got the links bucket. We've got the passive phase 1 bucket. We've got the passive phase 2 bucket. And we've got the super attack effect bucket. I know I just said bucket like 15 times, but if you want to get out like some notes and like draw these on a piece of paper, and just like draw like a little, like half square, half rectangle with like the top off, like a bucket, right? And you want to write like defense stat, links, not super attack, leader skill, passive phase 1, passive phase 2, super attack, right? I want you kind of to imagine those buckets in your mind, okay, as we're going through this. So, you know what? I'm even going to draw this for you guys. We're going to do this together. All right, so again, just to kind of reiterate, this is what I'm talking about with the buckets, right? So right here, we've got the stats, we've got the leader skill, we've got the links, we've got passive phase 1, we've got passive phase 2, and we've got the super attack effect. You guys can write your notes as you need to, but again, I want you guys to kind of think of these all as their own separate buckets. These do not interact with each other than they multiply against each other. But again, we'll get that into like a later discussion. But these things right here, everything that happens in its own bucket stays in its own bucket. They all add together within their own bucket, but they multiply against each other. So that's why kind of calling, whenever people say that passive phase 2 are multiplicative buffs, that's technically true, but really all these different buckets are multiplicative buffs. So that's why that's kind of like bad terminology, is like, your stat is multiplicative with your leader skill, which is multiplicative with your links, which is multiplicative with passive phase 1, which is multiplicative with passive phase 2, which is multiplicative with your super attack effect, right? So that's why I kind of want to establish that different terminology and have you guys think about these as separate buckets. Within the bucket, we interact, we mix, we mingle, we add together, and we become one substance. But whenever we interact with other buckets, that's when we multiply. So that's the imagery I kind of want you guys to have in your head whenever you think about all this stuff, is we have our own separate buckets for each of these buffs, and whenever they interact with each other, they multiply. Within the same bucket, they add. So that's kind of what I want you guys to get across. So we add within the same buckets, right? We add within the buckets, and then we multiply. We multiply with other buckets, okay? So we multiply whenever we talk about other buckets. Got it? All right. This is the last time I'm going to use this imagery, but I just wanted to kind of establish that, get this imagery in your head. This is what I want you guys thinking about, okay? Well, let's move on to just finishing the vocab. All right, so next up after the super attack effect phase is the support buffs. So a support buff is a character that provides a stat increase to other characters. Support buffs are not all the same and can be activated in different phases. So again, you could have support buffs that are in passive phase 1. You could have support buffs that are in passive phase 2. You can have support buffs that are super attack effects. Some could consider active skill buffs to have. We're going to get to that in a second. I probably should have put this one after that, but support buffs can be active skills. The support buffs could be considered domains. It just kind of depends. So this is just a general, like a support buff isn't always going to be in the same phase. What I want to get across with a support buff is that it's just another character helping another character, basically. So it increases something. All right. So again, most commonly, these are going to be in passive phase 1, but again, we'll get to that later. But these can be in all the different phases, all the different buckets. It's just going to kind of depend, and you'll have to learn how to spot these on your own. The next thing is an active skill buff. The increase a character receives when an active skill is activated during battle. Characters with an active skill flash orange and yellow, and the player must swipe up on the character in order to activate the effect. These come in a wide variety of effects from singular attacks to support. So for example, one of the first units with an active skill in the game was the LR Super Saiyan 4 Goku, the AGL one that released during the 4th anniversary. All he has for his active skill buff is a super attack. You pop it, and he launches a big attack against the enemy, and it does damage, and that's it. On the other hand, one of the other first active skill buff units was LRB Pan. LRB Pan, you use her active skill, and it gives all the characters on the rotation an attack buff for that turn. So just to get that in mind, again, if we're going back to our bucket example, active skill buffs are also their own bucket, okay? Domain buffs, these are increases a character receives when a domain is present on the battlefield. These are a newer buff that was introduced somewhat recently. So these are kind of like active skills in a sense, but these don't have to be activated, like you don't have to do anything sometimes to activate these. These come in a wide variety of effects, but they are also their own bucket, all right? So I think the most recent domain unit is the Int Broly that came out during the Worldwide Celebration. So just to let you guys know, domain buffs, domain and active skill buffs are a little bit more higher end whenever you're starting to get into like defense calcs, so they're not typically crucial when you're calculating, but we are getting more and more characters with these types of buffs, so you do want to keep them in mind because they can impact the unit, a unit's performance significantly because they are their own phase. They're each their own phase. So active skill buffs have their own bucket. Again, domain buffs have their own bucket. So if we were to go back to my Microsoft Paint example from earlier, you would actually need to add 2 more buckets, one for the active skill and one for the domain. So just to keep that in mind. One thing with domain buffs, you're really only ever going to have one domain active at a time. You can't have multiple at the moment. And active skill buffs, you can have multiples of those at a time, although I don't find it very common to have multiple active skill buffs up at a time. The last 3 words on here are pretty common, or well, I'm going to use these pretty commonly. Maybe not the third one. Okay, let me just shut up. So the next one on here is the base. This is probably the most important term I want you guys to walk away from here. Everything else here has been relatively simple. If you play the game, you understand pretty much everything that I've talked about up to this point. Maybe passive phase 1 and 2 was a little bit of a shock to you, or maybe that was new information, but everything else, right, has been pretty much new information, and we're, 18 minutes into this video. This is going to be a long one, I'm sorry. But the base. So when computing defense stats, or really just, working with percent increases in general, you must include the total defense calculated in the previous phase of the calculation. The base is typically represented as a 1. Again, we'll get into this later, but I want you guys to know what the base is. Whenever I'm going to be talking about the base like for the next 40 minutes of this video, okay? So I need you guys to understand what that is, all right? Anytime, that's one of the most common questions I get asked is like, why are you adding a 1 to this? I expected this to be 400%, so why aren't you just multiplying by 4? Why are you adding a 1 and making it 5, okay? we have to include the base whenever we're multiplying against the phases. And again, we'll get into that in a minute and why that's important. I always explain this whenever I do calculations, but it's easiest to understand this once we talk about links, right? So we'll get into that in a minute, but I need you guys to understand what the base is. The last two, I guess, are fairly simple. So a slot, whenever I talk about slots, this is just the attacking position of a character. Whenever you load into a turn, you have little bubbles at the bottom of the screen, right? You got your first character, your second character, and your third character all in a lineup right there. So that's your slots 1, 2, and 3 from left to right. So if a character's in slot 1, it's the character on the leftmost side of your screen. If the character is in slot 2, it's the one in the middle. And if there's a character in slot 3, that's the one at the end. If you guys don't know, just talking about slots here, you get a little bit of bonus information in case you didn't know for maybe new players. The characters that stay in slots 1 and 2 will remain on that rotation. So I didn't add a word for rotation here. I'm just kind of making this up on the fly. I mean, this is correct information. I'm not making it up, but I'm adding this to the slides. It's not actually here. But a rotation, right, is going to be your odd and even rotations, or turns, I guess. So, for example, on turn 1, if you leave the characters that you put in slots 1 and 2, those two characters will return on turn 3. The character in slot 3 will get what we call floated off and will return onto the even rotation. So the characters in slots 1 and 2 will remain on their respective rotation, either the odd rotation or the even rotation. So turns 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. And then you have your even rotation, which is going to be turns 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, again, etc. So the characters that you leave in slots 1 and 2 will remain on either their odd or even rotation. The character that you put in slot 3 will move from the odd rotation to the even rotation, or from the even rotation to the odd rotation. And it takes 3 turns for that to happen. So on turn 1, the character that you put in slot 3 will come back on turn 4. On turn 2, the character that you put in slot 3 will come back on turn 5. Got it? Okay. Again, that's you'll just kind of pick that up playing the game a little bit. You'll start to notice that. You'll go, "Oh, I put that character there. Where'd they go? Oh, they're on the even rotation now. Oh, I put this character here. Oh, they're back." Okay? So you'll start to pick up on that. That's a little bit easier to see in game. That's more of a beginner's guide discussion probably, but I just figured I'd throw that in here for the, nuance. This is a learning video. We're already 22 minutes in. We're in basic vocabulary. All right? This is going to be a long video. The last word I wanted to get in here was nuking. I kind of added this on at the last minute as I was working on another part of the slides. These are just percentage buffs that increase as a character obtains more orbs. I thought this was important to include because not everyone may know what that means. If people talk about nuking buffs, if you're new or if you haven't played the game very long or just if you've never quite understood what people were talking about, that's what they're referring to. And I'll have an example of that later in the video. All right, so that's basic vocabulary out of the way. Again, sorry, I'm very long-winded with these explanations, but I just wanted to kind of get everything out there for you guys because I don't want you leaving this video with me not having explained something well. I'm always happy to explain things in the comments, but I just want to feel like I'm giving you guys a full explanation as we're going into it now. And again, especially in the vocabulary part, because if you don't understand what I'm talking about, then as we go through this, you're just going to get more and more confused. So let's go ahead. We're going to start out now with step 1. The first thing we need to do is determine a character's defense stat. Again, I know that sounds very basic, but it is the first thing that we need to do. So what do we do to do that? So the first step is just look at the character in game. If you have the character, look at them. If you don't, look at it in the banners, look at it on the friends list. Just do that. If you don't have any other way to do that, use your external resources. Again, I always have links to Dokkan info, the Dokkan wiki, the Dokkan fandom wiki, all in my description below. You can look up the characters on there, figure out the defense stats. On this slide, actually, I have the summonable hidden potential system, at least for the rainbow stats right here. So if you're ever curious what a character is at, at Rainbow, right? These are the buffs that they get from their hidden potential system. Another good resource that you can use is the Dokkan Wiki. For example, right here we have, Anaraza, and you can see like right down here, they've got an option for his stats at 55%. You can see it right there. You can change it to 69. That would be with 1 dupe typically, 2 dupes, 79%, 3 dupes, 90%, and then 100% right here as always. So this is a great resource. Again, link in the description. This is dokkan.wiki, and you can see these stats. So you can figure this all out, online. Use your external resources. Don't click on the wrong slide 100 times in your own video. And then add equipment. So if you say like, okay, this character has 12,000 defense, but I'm planning on putting a plus 800 equip on them, obviously add 800 to your calc, right? So if I go back to my Excel sheet right here, we just have an example defense of 12,000. If I want to say, okay, we're going to have a, equipment on here of 800, you just change it to 800. I mean, I know this is simple, but step one is figure out what your defense is. Sometimes you have to calculate that. Whenever they post whenever they post the units on Twitter, right, they don't do it at Rainbow. They don't do it at 55%. They post the units at 0%. So you're always going to have to kind of figure out the stats on your own. For 55%, you're going to add 2,000 to it. For Rainbow, you're going to want to add, again, I have this table right here. If it's an AGL unit, you'll add 5,400 to the defense. If it's tech, you'll add 5,000. Int, you add 5,000. STR, you add 4,600. Physical, you add 4,600. So whenever you see those posts come out on Twitter, and we've got the Twitter details there, and you can see the defense stat. That's at 0%, so you're going to need to add the applicable stat to it based on the typing that they are. Again, you add 2,000 for 55%. For Rainbow, you add these numbers down here on the table. Lastly, one thing I did want to throw in here is, for example, the Super Saiyan 2, Goku, and Vegeta. They posted the details on the JP Twitter, but they didn't actually post the stats whenever they did that. So if you're ever curious how people are calculating those stats, I do have those pulled up for Vegeta right here. So what you do is you take a unit's max stat before any hidden potential system is factored in. So if I go back to Vegeta right here and we scroll down to his stats, you see this base max column right here. That's the highest his stats can be before he's EZA'd, before his hidden potential is factored in. These are the highest his stats can be right here. So you take those, right? So we've got HP, we've got attack, we've got defense. You're going to subtract out the base minimum right here. So this is his stats at level 1. Again, right here. So this base minimum. So that's your 3318, your 3787, and your 2053. So you're going to subtract those, and you're going to take the difference, right? So 7632, 8713, 4722. Again, that's this minus this, this minus this, this minus this. So base max minus base min, okay? So again, this is max stat at like level, for example, 120 for TURs, minus their level 1 stats, no hidden potential. I'm just reiterating. You're going to take that difference, you're going to multiply that by 0.4839. Don't ask me why. That's just the number. Okay? And then you're going to take that difference, so 7632 multiplied by 0.4839, 8713 times 0.4839, etc. You're going to take that number, add the max stat. So again, that's this number right here, the 950, the 12.5, the 6755. So you can see that's the exact same number. And you're going to add that, and then you're also going to add your hidden potential boost now, right? So we can factor that in. So if I've done this correctly, which I have, and you can check my math. So again, this minus this equals 7632 multiplied by 0.4839 equals 3693. So then you do 3693 plus the 10550, or the 10950, and then you're going to add in the hidden potential boost. Again, this is a tech character. We're talking about tech Super Saiyan 2 Vegeta. So tech right here gets 4,600 to HP, 5,400 to attack, 5,000 to defense. You're going to add all three of these numbers up, and then that's going to give you your EZA stat right here, or at least pretty close. Dokkan, I believe, rounds down. I can't remember to what integer, but Dokkan does round down, so you're going to come into like maybe within like 1 or 2 points. Overall, that's going to be immaterial to your overall calculation. But if I now go back over to that Vegeta, again, keep these numbers in mind, 19,243, 22,116, 14,060. If I go back over to here, 19,243, 22,116, 14,060. The exact same numbers that I calculated here. So if you were ever wondering how people calculate those stats, this is how they do it. So whenever they announce those EZA details on the JP account and they don't post the stats with them, now you too can figure it out on your own. You know, post those online and get a bunch of clout. I just have this set up right here. This is an excerpt, right? Like this is a little screenshot, but I have this set up as an Excel formula. So all I have to do is change these green numbers, and then everything else calculates on its own. So I change, you know, this number, this number, this number, this number, this number, this number, and then I fill in the hidden potential system, and then everything else calculates for me on its own. It's all formulated, it's set up. So you can make one of these on your own. I said Excel, but it's actually in Google Sheets. So you can make one of these for yourself. Again, have the formula set up, and then as soon as a character drops, you can type in, you know, what is that, 9 numbers, and then boom, you're good to go. So if you were ever wondering how to do that on your own, that is how you do it. That's step 1. We got to figure out the defense stat. So now that we've done that, let's move on to step 2. So the next thing to do is determine the team or the leader skill that you are going to use. Every team is going to have 2 leaders. Typically, it's going to be the same unit. That's going to be 99% of scenarios, unless you just can't find a friend unit, which can happen. But overall, for the most part, you're going to be using the same leader. We are currently in the 200% leader skill meta that was introduced during the 7th anniversary. So many characters are going to receive total buffs of 400%. The way we calculate that is we have a 200% leader, we have a second 200% leader, combine those together, 400%, right? That's as simple as it gets. It's the easiest way to calculate characters. Most people calculate assuming 200% leaders. Most characters that come out these days have 200% leaders. I think it was Super Boo that for the longest time, whenever he released, did not have a 200% leader, I believe. So, you know, occasionally it can happen to where a character doesn't have one, or maybe the ones that they do have are not very good or are not common. So maybe it does make sense to not calculate using a 200% leader. But for the most part, most calcs that you're going to see most of the time, mostly, are going to be using 200% leaders for the calculation. So if you're not using 200% leaders, you'll need to adjust your calc accordingly, and then I gave some examples. If you're using a 170 and a 200, it's going to be 370. If you're using 2 170s, it's going to be 340, etc. So, you know, 2 150s would be 300. A 150 and a 170 would be 320. You know, just you guys can figure it out from there. And then leader skills are typically based on categories in the modern era. In order to be on a 200% leader, you must first match the 170% category requirement, then subsequently match the 30% category requirement. Again, that may be basic info for most of you out there, but I did just want to cover that in the video. And if you're ever unsure, Dokkan info shows a character's 200% leaders. So again, for example, with this Super Saiyan 2 Vegeta or Majin Vegeta, there's a button right here for 200% leaders, and it shows you all of his applicable teams, right? So you can click on that, and then boom, you can see who his 200% leader skills are, and it's that simple. And then if you wanted to see like, oh, well, what about if I want to run them on Worthy Rivals? You click on that, and it'll load, and it'll show you right here who the leaders are for the category and what their leader skill buffs are. So Piccolo's 170, Tien's 130, the Piccolo and Vegeta's 130, and then this Vegeta's 150. So just keep that in mind. Dokkan Info, very useful website. I love this website. Thank you to Harry Turney for keeping this up. It's a super, super, super amazing website. So again, use Dokkan Info, use your outside resources if you have to, if you're ever unsure if a character's on a 200% leader skill or not. Sometimes the website can take a little bit to update after like a new data download, so a character may not immediately be there. So just, keep that in mind as well. All right, so in order to convert a percent into a decimal, what you want to do is drop the percentage sign and add a decimal after the first number in a percent to convert it to a whole number. So as an example, 400% written as a whole number is going to be 4.00. Again, I know that's probably basic for many of you out there, but for more of the mathematically challenged, as we'll say, that may not be an obvious thing. So, 400% is the exact same as writing a number out as 4.00. So, if you had 5%, that's going to be 0.05, right? You kind of have to imagine, the extras like numbers in there. But anyway, for a leader skill buff, right, the most common you'll see is 400%. Like we mentioned, 200% leader skills. So, 400% as a whole number is going to be 4.00. Now, this is where I probably get the most questions whenever we're talking about defense. And as I mentioned earlier, you must include the base when multiplying. So instead of multiplying by 4 for 200% leaders, you instead multiply by 5. And so I kind of have like some examples down here. First one just being like a general explanation, and then the second one being like an actual example, and we'll go into Excel to actually look at it. So the 400% buff is the amount your defense increases by. So for example, if I have 10 apples, right? I've got 10. I've got a nice bushel of apples, and I increase the amount of apples that I have by 400%. I do not have 40 apples, right? So, most people just say, oh, you got 10 apples, you increased it 400%, you got 40 apples because you multiply by 4. That's not correct. I have 50 apples now. 100% of 10 apples is 10 apples, right? You have 100%, 100% 10 is 10, right? We agree. Do we agree? Again, another way to write that is 100% is 1 of, whenever we're talking about math, typically means you multiply. So 1 multiplied by 10 equals 10. If I were to then multiply that by 4, which is the amount I increased by, I get 40 apples. And again, this is the amount I increased my apples by, bringing my total apples to 50, right? I had 10. I increased the amount by 400%. So I had 10. I gained 40. Now I have a total of 50. If you were to divide 50 by 10, so 50 is the total apples that I have now, divided by 10, you get 5, right? That's the multiplier. That's why we use 5 whenever we multiply by leader skills. This is the 4 for the 400% increase, and then we have to add the additional 1 to include the base of 10 apples, right? 4 times 10, 40, and then 10 times 1, 10. Add that together. That's your increase. And again, this is a little bit easier to explain with links, but I just wanted to keep that in mind. So I have like an example written down here. A unit has 12,000 defense. If they are on a double 200% leader skill team, their defense is not 60,000. Or I'm sorry, their defense is 60,000 before any other buffs are considered. 12,000 multiplied by 5 equals 60,000, or you have 12,000 defense at 400% is 48,000. That's your buff that you get. So you take your buff of 48,000, add it to your 12,000, which is your base. Boom, now you got 60,000. I hope that makes sense. Again, we're going to talk about the base a lot. But anytime you jump buckets, you got to include the previous bucket, right? You're going to have the increases from the new buckets, but you got to include the old bucket in your calculation. And again, I'll pull up an example here in a minute, and we'll walk through a calc. But for now, I just want to kind of have that in your mind, okay? The next step, step 3, is determine your active links, okay? This is probably the easiest step of all of them. Most characters have at least one link that provides them defense. For most Saiyans, it's going to be prepared for battle. For most villains, it's going to be big bad bosses, maybe thirst for conquest. If you're ever unsure what links a unit has that gives them defense, again, just look it up. We got Dokkan info, we've got the Dokkan wiki, all those resources. If you have them leveled up in game, you can look at it there. Just different things like that. Most people who are doing calculations are going to assume that a character is at level 10 links, receiving their highest buff that they can get. So just keep that in mind. I would always encourage you to try to consider realistic scenarios, but you don't have to. These are your calcs. You know, if you want to say, I'm linking Lord Slug with the old physical giant form Lord Slug, that's great. You do that. I don't know that you're ever in a million years going to be using that physical giant Lord Slug, but maybe you are. Prove me wrong. I don't care. That's up to you, okay? But just kind of keep that in mind whenever you go and do these calcs, right? It's like you want to have a linking partner in mind a lot of the time. You know, Halvard's pretty good about that. He'll tell you like who he's using as a linking partner, and then from there you can look and see how many links they share, what links they share, how much defense that gives them, etc. So I say try to keep it practical, but you do you. If you just want to assume all their links are active, none of their links are active, try it all different kinds of ways. That's up to you. Once you figure it out, you can figure it out however you want. So, after you multiply your defense stat by your leader skill buff in the previous step, you then multiply that number by 1 plus your links. So if we continue on the previous example, where we had 12,000 defense on a double 200% leader skill, and we got up to 60,000 defense, right? And a character has prepared for battle. Prepared for battle gives them 5% defense at link level 10. You write that as 0.05. Then you would take 60,000 multiplied by 1.05 is equal to 63,000. All right. Now going back up to my previous point. However, if you multiply your defense, right, the 60,000 by 0.05, that would mean your defense goes down, right? Like if we go back to this Excel sheet, right? So we agree 12,000 is our defense stat. We have a leader skill buff of 200% times 2, right? So that's 400%. So we take this, multiplied by 5, like I said. Now we've got links. Okay? And we're going to have 5% for prepared for battle. Sorry, I can't type. Okay, if I was to take this number, right, 60,000, most of you would say, okay, you take 60,000, multiply by 5%. Well, our defense doesn't go down to 3,000, does it? That doesn't make any sense. You know, raise your hand if that makes any sense to you. For us to activate a link, you know, our links cause our defense to go up, but why is it going down? Well, it's because we only multiplied by 5%. 5% is the increase that we receive, right? So our defense goes from 60,000. It increases by 5%. So we have to include the base. So we don't do, 60,000 multiplied by 0.05. You have to add the 1 to include the 60,000. And so now, if we do 60,000 multiplied by 1.05, again, 1 includes the base. 0.05 is the increase that we get from the links, 5%. We go up to 63,000. That's an increase of 5%. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense to you guys a little bit more, because I know it's always a little bit of a struggle to understand, well, why are we taking this and multiplying it by 5? We're getting a buff of 400%. And it's because our buff is 400%. You're correct, right? If I was to take 60,000, subtract 12, yeah, 48,000 divided by 12 is 4, or 400%. You're right. We are getting a 400% buff. But that's the buff. That's the increase that we're getting. That's not our new defense stat. So we have to take the 48,000 and add it to the 12 to get to the 60. Same thing here. We're getting a buff of 5% from our links bucket, right? So we're not going down to 3,000. We're going up to 63,000. I hope that makes a little bit more sense now whenever we talk about links. So that's why you got to include the base. You always got to include the base because that's going to include your previous bucket. You don't want to leave that previous bucket just like off on its own, alone in the sad, and it's cold and it freezes, and then you try to go like, heat it up and stick your feet in it, but it takes too long, and now you've got like a cold forever and you're dying in the winter and the polar bears eat you. You don't want that. You don't want that. So include your base, all right? A house is built on a sturdy foundation, build your house on a rock, not on sand, all that good stuff, okay? So that's why you got to include the base. You got to include the 1. Pretty much anytime you see a percentage and you start multiplying and doing defense calcs, it's going to seem like it's one number too high because we got to include the base. All right, so let's move on. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense to you. We're going to move on to the next step, which is going to be passive phase 1. Again, this is where we start getting a little bit tricky, and I put a little note of like time to transition to Excel for our examples. We're already doing that, all right? Ignore the pink note. And don't forget the base, all right? Don't forget that. I'm going to remind you again here in a minute. You guys are going to get so tired of me saying the base. You're going to be like, bro, I'm already on base. You can't tag me. Anyway, in general, these are buffs a character receives when no other action is taken. The most common way you will see these buffs written is just attack and defense plus whatever percent, 200%, 100%, 150%. That is the most common way you're going to see that. So if we go back over to Vegeta as an example, boom. Key plus 2, attack and defense plus 150%. That is a phase 1 passive buff right there. You don't have to do anything to get that. No matter what, Vegeta is always going to have that buff activated. If he's not on a leader skill, if he doesn't have any links activated, if he's just thrown on there, that buff will always be activated no matter what. And that's why I say in general, that's, your passive phase 1 buffs is because those are the buffs that you're looking for. He doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to super attack, doesn't have to dodge. He just gets that for free. All right. So some other common examples that you'll see, they can be HP restricted. So I pulled this directly out of Vegeta's passive. He gets plus an additional defense boost by up to 120%. The less HP remaining, the greater the defensive boost. I know that kind of contradicts what I said earlier where, you kind of say like, oh, well, we have to take an action now. We have to lower our HP. But not really. We don't have to take an action, right? The boss takes an action against us, lowers our HP, we get that. But there's nothing else that we have to do as a character to do that. Vegeta does not have to take any action to get that activated, right? He enters the turn. Your HP is at a certain level. The game reads that, and it puts it into passive phase 1. So again, if we're looking at Vegeta, we have this right here as passive phase 1, and now we have this right here, and we have this right here. Both of these are part of or I guess all 3 of these, but I mean, this one's an attack boost, so we're not really talking about attack in this video. But the same concepts that I'm talking about in this defense video apply to attack as well. So you can kind of translate that over. They have like one extra phase because of the like super attack multiplier, but we won't get into that in this video. 1 second. Sorry, I had to let out a yawn. Didn't want you guys to catch that on camera. So anyway, these right here are our passive phase 1 buffs. Again, most people refer to these as start of turn buffs. That's not always correct. That's why I want to refer to these as passive phase 1. Notice Vegeta's not having to do anything to activate these, right? He just gets these. Another common example that you'll see are they can be slot restricted. So, for example, I took this out of Vegeta and Trunks, LR Vegeta and Trunks, the Int one, the Gallic Gun, Father-Son Gallic Gun unit. So I cut out a little bit and paraphrased it, but attack and defense plus 70% as the first attacker in a turn. Again, that kind of sounds like you have to take an action. But again, it's kind of a gray zone. You learn about these as you learn to do calcs, but this is another common one. If a unit has to be in a specific slot for it to happen, that's also going to be a passive phase 1 buff most of the time. I'm trying to think of an example where it wouldn't be. I guess Piccolo Jr. would be a good example. The Int Piccolo Jr., he gets like attack and defense plus 30% when attacking as the second or third attacker in the turn, right? Notice how it has the qualifier of when attacking as the first and second attacker in the turn, right? That's Piccolo Jr. Whereas Vegeta and Trunks right here is just as the first attacker in the turn. It's not actually when attacking, it's just as soon as the turn locks in and it reads that you're in slot 1, it's going to give you that attack and defense plus 70% boost. So just to kind of get that out of the way, right, that's going to go into the same bucket. So that's not an additional multiplicative buff. The thing that sucks about this one is that you'll never actually see that buff. You'll never get to see that number, right? You can put a character in slot 1, but you're not going to get to see that, right? It's not going to, until the game reads that you have collected orbs with your third character and the game reads that the turn is locked in, that's when it'll activate that buff. So you can't click on your characters after that, so you never actually get to see that number, but that's what's happening, is it's going, okay, you've collected orbs in slot 1, collected orbs in slot 2, collected orbs in slot 3, Vegeta and Trunks are in slot 1, got it, and then you'll see the numbers increase and it'll give them that boost. But as far as the defense, you can't actually see it. You'll see the attack go up, but we can't see the defense. So that's, I just wanted to let you know that these buffs can be slot restricted, but they're still in passive phase 1. Another one is nuking passives. We talked about these earlier in our vocab, but just a common way this is written is plus an additional attack and defense plus 30% per key sphere obtained. Again, so that's every time you get one key sphere, you get 30% attack and defense. So that would also add into this same phase. So if a character gets 100% defense at the start of turn, and then they get 30% attack and defense per orb, then they get 100% baseline, and then let's say you collect 10 orbs, now they have 400% at the start of turn, right? Because they had 100%, you collected 10 orbs, 10 times 30 is 300, 100 plus 300 is 400, so now your total start of turn boost is 400, and you can generally see those buffs at the start of turn, nuking buffs. Nuking buffs can also be in passive phase 2. A good example of that is the GT Super Saiyan Goku and the GT Super Saiyan Vegeta that came out for Golden Week in 2020, I believe. Maybe 2021. I can't exactly remember. Maybe 2021 is whenever they came out. But when those units came out, right, theirs is written very similar to this, where it's like, plus an additional attack and defense, plus 30% per key sphere obtained. But then it says the very nice qualifier of when performing a super attack, right? So your character has to perform an action in order to activate those. That's kind of how you can distinguish between passive phase 1 and passive phase 2. So if they just get it, they just get it, right? But if you have to perform an action, that's where it's going to be part of passive phase 2. So again, this is the passive phase 1 and the passive phase 2 are where most people are going to have like the biggest learning curve for this. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys some examples, right? So again, you're just going to commonly see it written as attack and defense plus B, and that's it. There's going to be your HP restrictions. There's going to be your slot restrictions, your nuking passives. And I did want to tell you, again, you may not always see these buffs. Like I mentioned with the slot restriction buffs, you're just never going to see those. You're not, because they are activated once the turn locks in. Most support characters offer passive phase 1 buffs. I'm trying to think of a good example offhand. High School Gohan, I guess, right? I don't know why he comes to mind, but, anytime you see in a character's kit, all allies, 3 key attack and defense plus 40%, that's another phase 1 buff right there. There are passive phase 2 buffs. A character that comes in mind is the Battle of Gods Vegeta, that tech Vegeta that came out alongside God Goku. If you read his passive support buff, it says something along the lines of like, all allies attack and defense plus 35% after receiving 3 attacks. Notice again how the character has to receive attacks in order to activate that. Again, that's an indicator that it's in the other phase, passive phase 2. You know, it's written in his passive, but it doesn't activate at the start of turn. It's not activated until he receives attacks, so it goes into that separate phase. That's why it can cause characters to have, you know, what seems like a much higher defense stat, or a much higher, like, potent buff to it, because it is in that different phase. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind, is you do need to pay attention to where these support buffs are. Most support buffs, whenever people talk about, you know, like 50% support, 40% support, 35% support, most of the time it is coming in passive phase 1, but sometimes, you know, it could come in passive phase 2. The only 2 notable ones I can think of offhand are that Battle of Gods Vegeta, and then King Vegeta also has a part that activates whenever he performs a super attack. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that sometimes you will have characters that activate it in different slots. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but another common one that's becoming more common is the on super attack effect support buffs, right? We have characters now that whenever they perform a super attack, in their super attack effect, they give support to allies. So that is also a separate phase. But I just wanted to kind of get it out of the way that whenever people generally talk about support characters, most of the time they're talking about support characters that give a buff in passive phase 1. All right. And then another note here is these buffs, so the buffs in passive phase 1, always pool together into the same phase and never multiply against each other. This is a very common mistake people make in Calcs. So, for example, right, if a character gets 100% defense at the start of turn, and they go, oh, they get 70% defense when they get put in slot 1, right? They'll look at that and go, oh, I just take what I see right now, and I multiply by 1.7, and boom, that's going to be their defense. And it's like, no, it's not. It's a little bit complicated, but you have to figure out what their other start of turn buffs are that appear. So, like, for example, if we go back to this number, and let's say that we have a character that gets 100% in passive phase 1. I can't see. Passive phase 1, right? And then they get an additional 70% in slot 1. Dang it. In slot 1, also in passive phase 1, right? So they'll take this 63,000 and they'll multiply by 2. Again, we got to include the base, right? 100% of 63,000 is 63,000, right? So we got to include the original 63,000, otherwise our defense stays the same. And that doesn't make any sense. It's going to go up. It increases by itself, 100%. It doubles. So 63 multiplied by 2 is 126,000. And then people will see, oh, whenever I put this character in slot 1, they get an additional 70% defense. So they take this and they multiply by 1.7. They're like, oh, they're going to be at 214,000. Incorrect. So what you would actually have to do is you say, okay, our current defense is 126,000. We know it's 126,000 because we have 100% activated right now. So we have to actually technically, and again, sorry, this is a little bit, it's going to sound complicated. It's not, but I promise it's a little, it sounds more complicated than it is. We have to divide out the buff that's already active. So we divide by 2, right? So the reason we're dividing by 2 is to get rid of the 100% buff that's already activated. And then we would say, okay, our total passive phase 1 boost after everything is all said and done is 170%. So we're removing the 100% that's already activated. We're getting that out of there. That's gone. We're back down. You can see it kind of highlighted at the top of your screen right here, right? We're getting us back to the 63,000. Okay? And so what we have to do now is say, okay, we're going to multiply. We're back at 63,000. We have ignored our passive phase 1 buffs. They're all gone. So now we're basically starting back at ground zero. So what are we going to multiply by? Well, we know we have 100% activated. We know as soon as we go in slot 1 and the turn locks in, we're going to get another 70%. We know that's in the same bucket. We have to add within our same bucket, right? We multiply against other buckets. We add within the same buckets. 100% plus 70% is 170%. That is our total passive phase 1 boost, right? So 170% We know we have to include the base of 63,000. So we have 1 plus 1.7, because 1.7 is the exact same thing as 170%. And so we're going to multiply by 2.7 for a total boost of 170,100, which again is different from the 126 multiplied by 1.7. Oops. Times 1.7, right? You can see that is a, what is that, 40,000? Yeah, 44,000 difference in defense, right? So this is what our actual defense is going to be, right? We agree. We took out the 100%, and then we added it back with the 70, and that's where we get. So I know that sounds like a complicated process. Another way to think about it is to just ignore this altogether. And this is typically what I'll do in my calcs these days, is I'll just make it simple. And I'll say, okay, in total, our passive phase 1, it's 100% plus 70%, slot 1 for a total boost. I keep making that little apostrophe thing. Okay, so plus 70% for slot 1. And I'll just skip that whole dividing step, and I'll just say, okay, we're just going to multiply by 2.7. That's how I do my calcs now. It's like, it gets too confusing showing too many steps sometimes. So what I want to do is just say, okay, we know we have 100% activated. Let's just assume we're going to put them in slot 1 because that's where the devs are intending us to use them. They're giving that buff for a reason. So let's just, not make it more complicated than it needs to be. Let's not divide out the original buffs. Let's just say 63,000. Let's multiply it by 170,000 plus the base. Or I'm sorry, 170% plus the base, so 2.7. And let's just get to the 170, right? It's a little bit easier whenever you're starting from scratch like this, but I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. So again, sorry, my apologies. I just had I had to sneeze. You guys don't care. We're an hour into this video. But, that's where people tend to get in trouble a lot, is they start multiplying within the same phase. They forget to take out the buffs that are already active, add them together, and then throw them back in. That's what you got to understand. Sometimes you got to say, you got to back up a step. You got to take out everything that's in a certain phase. So you got to, take out your passive phase 1 buffs, add them together, throw them back in. You got to take out your passive phase 2 buffs, add them together, throw them back in. Whenever you have these different buffs activated. Another one is stacking, right? Like, people sometimes forget to take out stacks and things like that. So, again, it sounds more complicated than what I'm actually talking about, and it's easier. Like, once you start calculating these things and seeing the numbers in game and getting a feel for it, this is where just practice comes in, is you'll start calculating the numbers and you'll go, well, wait a minute, that's not what's shown in game. How do we get there? And if you go, oh, I forgot to, I'm double counting a certain phase, right? Like, if you're double counting your 100 and your 70, right? Like, you're saying, okay, I'm multiplying by 100 and then I'm multiplying by the 70, but you're not adding them together, that's where you're going to get into trouble. Most calc errors are made because you're double counting a phase. You don't want to, multiply within the same phase. You want to make sure that your phases are getting added together, right? And then multiplied against the other phases, and not multiplied within themselves, right? Keep your buckets. Your buckets are always adding with each other. So just keep that in mind. All right, next thing is passive phase 2. That's going to be step 5. Again, this slide's going to look very similar, except for the examples are going to be a little bit different. So these are buffs that a character has when an action is taken generally. Again, generally speaking. These can be on attack or on super attack. So an example here is plus an additional attack and defense plus 50% when performing a super attack. Notice how it's when performing. We have to perform an action. You can have it when receiving an attack, plus an additional defense plus 50% when receiving an attack, right? These are all taken out of, kits, right? Like, this is pretty much exact wording out of certain characters. This can be when dodging, so plus an additional defense plus 30% plus 100 up to 150% when with each attack evaded, right? So we're having to perform some sort of action. We're getting hit. We're doing a super attack. We're doing an attack. We're dodging an attack. We're guarding. Things like that. Those are going to be your passive phase 2 buffs, right? You're having to perform some sort of action generally speaking, in order to activate these. Like I mentioned with the GT Duo or with the GT Super Saiyans earlier, right? It's like we're having to collect orbs. That's great. You know, that's a phase 1 buff typically, but it says, you know, I should just go ahead and pull it up so you guys know what I'm talking about. All right, here's the Super Saiyan Vegeta right here. So plus an additional attack and defense plus 10% when performing a super attack per key sphere obtained, right? So the other example that I gave you in this previous slide was just plus an additional attack and defense plus 30% per key sphere obtained. Notice Vegeta's is when performing a super attack. He's having to do an action. So whenever you collect those orbs, you're not actually going to see this buff activated. You will not see it until he actually does his super attack, and then even then you're not actually going to see it, right? So that's just another example, right, of passive phase 2. Right here, this is actually going to be passive phase 1, just as another example right here. So if we're doing like a little quiz, right, and we're doing our passive test, right, so attack and defense plus 180%, defense plus 120%. We agree that's passive phase 1. Plus an additional attack and defense plus 100 or plus 10% when performing a super attack per key sphere obtained. Passive phase 2. Plus an additional attack plus 50% per GT Heroes category ally attacking in the same turn. We're not having to do anything for that, right? We just have to have other characters around us. Nothing that we have to do, right? There's no action that this Vegeta has to take. This is going to be a passive phase 1 buff, right? So this would add into this 180 right here. Got it? Passive phase 1. Passive phase 1, passive phase 2. Got it? The more you get familiar with this and the more you start getting to understand what are the different phases, what's going into each phase, that's where you'll start getting more familiar with calcs and understanding how to walk through these things. So back over to our presentation. Again, you may not always see these, or I'm sorry, back over to stage 5. So, but yeah, back on phase 1. You may not always see passive phase 1 buffs. Passive phase 2 buffs, most of the time you're not going to see those, but sometimes you will. But let's see, where do we want to jump to? So we already read all these. So I kind of already covered this. There are many passive phase 2 buffs. If you are ever unsure, ask, just go to the comments, ask me a question, ask your fellow Dokkaner a question. Maybe they don't know. You got to be careful about who you ask because there are a lot of people out there who are confidently wrong, including myself. A lot of the times it's not that they're, relaying bad information purposefully. It's just that, they may be ignorant to what's actually going on. And I mean, that happens to me constantly. So, never feel bad if you get wrong info. But, just always be open-minded. I wouldn't consider myself the premier source of, all things calculating knowledge, right? But, I can answer most questions for you in terms of, defensive calcs. So, but yeah, it takes time to learn what is and is not part of the different passive phases. But as you learn, you'll just kind of pick up on what is and is not, okay? I guess I should say what is and is not an. My poor typing skills are showing here. Some passive phase 2 buffs are permanent and do not reset each turn. So another good example of this is the Piccolo Jr. Let me go ahead and get him pulled up. All right, so this is definitely a little bit more of a longer passive, right, than what we just saw previously. But right here you can see plus an additional attack and defense plus 20% with each super attack performed up to 100% right here. So we agree that this is passive phase 2. Right, because it says with each super attack performed up to 100%. But what it doesn't say is when performing a super attack. It says with each super attack performed. So what that implies is that once you super attack, that 20% buff is always going to be active in passive phase 2, right? It's on now. You're going to see it. You're going to feel it. You're going to, be able to look down at your character and you're going to see that their defense is higher permanently now by that 20%, that 40%, 60, 80, up to 100%, right? So that's just something to keep in mind is that, whereas with passive phase 1, you may not always get to see them. Most of passive phase 2 you're not going to see, but sometimes like this, where once it's activated, it's on, you're going to be able to see that defense, right? So that's just something to keep in mind right there. And again, if we're just doing another quiz, let's go ahead and just look at Piccolo Jr. So this is his entrance animation, right? People call these intro buffs. So upon his entry turn, he gets a bunch of stuff, but he also gets attack and defense plus 101% for 5 turns from the entry turn. You may be wondering, is that passive phase 1 or is that passive phase 2? Well, if we look at it, what's he having to do? He just enters the turn. You don't have to do anything, right? Like you just start the battle, he gets 101%. So that's going to be passive phase 1. And then again, like I said, very common, attack and defense plus 150%. That's also passive phase 1. Plus an additional attack and defense plus 20% with each super attack performed, passive phase 2. Plus an additional attack and defense plus 60% within the same turn after receiving an attack, right? Right there. That's after receiving an attack. So that's going to be passive phase 2. Plus an additional attack and defense plus 100% and all allies attack and defense minus 30% as the first attacker in a turn. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because they put it on the same line. But it's separated by a comma, right? Kind of notice that. So kind of imagine this as its own bullet point, and then this right here as its own bullet point. Sorry, one second. Okay, so this will activate right here. This 100% attack and defense will activate as soon as the turn locks in, and that's going to be part of passive phase 1. This part right here will not activate until you receive that attack in slot 1. It's a little bit confusing. This one's a little bit tricky, but this is passive phase 2, contingent on being the first attacker in the turn. This right here is only contingent on being the first attacker in the turn, right? So this has 2 conditions. This is you have to receive attack and be the first attacker in the turn. So this is passive phase 2 because you have to receive an attack. This part is passive phase 1. The only condition is as the first attacker in the turn. It's a little bit confusing. That's a little bit more of an advanced example, but that's where I just wanted to kind of get you guys where it's a little bit tricky, right? But I wanted to kind of get you with that one. So then right here, plus an additional attack and defense plus 100% when performing a super attack. When performing a super attack. And blah, 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 as the second or third attacker in a turn. So then this one right here is also when performing a super attack as the second or third attacker in the turn, right? Notice how there's no separation like this one. This one up here is, we have this 100% buff right here. This is separated. This is separate from receiving the attack. But this, when receiving an attack, is tied to as the first attacker in the turn. This right here is only tied, or this one right here is tied to both. I'm explaining this poorly, all right? Well, let's just recap. Passive phase 1, passive phase 1, passive phase 2, passive phase 2, passive phase 1, passive phase 2. All right? I know that's a little bit fast, that's a little bit down and dirty, but that's just where I wanted to show you guys where these characters really mix and match where all this different stuff is happening. So I wanted to kind of just get that in for you. Back over to the presentation. Again, these buffs always pool together and are always in the same phase and never multiply against each other. So going back to our example of Piccolo Jr., right? This 100% right here, right? We determined that this always stays active. Like once you get this activated, you're going to see this at the start of turn. So let's say, for example, we can actually calculate this. Let me just go ahead and turn our example into this version. All right, so here we go. I kind of turned my example into Piccolo Jr. right here. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this, right? So Piccolo Jr. has a rainbow defense stat of 13,425. Let's use everything we've learned so far. So that's going to be our starting number in our calculation. We're going to assume that he's on a 200% leader skill. So what do we multiply by? 5. We kind of had a little Dora moment there, but we multiply by 5. So 13,425, multiply it by 5. That gets us 67,125. For my example, I assume that we're going to have Big Bad Bosses and Thirst for Conquest activated. Big Bad Bosses is 25% defense at level 10 links. Thirst for Conquest is 15% defense at level 10 links. Add those together. That's, 40% defense that we get from links. So we take 67,125 and multiply it by 1.4. And that's going to get us up to 93,975, okay? The next thing is I went ahead and assumed that his intro buff is still up for us. He has his intro buff for 5 turns, so that's, a pretty long time. You can definitely, with this guy's additionals and everything like that, it's pretty common to see this buff up and have this fully built up at the same time. So I went ahead and assumed that we have that. So again, this is passive phase 1. This is passive phase 1. We add within our phase, we add within our buckets. So 101% plus 150% is 251%. All right, good job, good job. So we're going to take 93,975 and multiply by 3.51, right? 251% plus the base is 3.51. Now, we have our 2 passive phase 2 buffs, right? So this is what I was talking about earlier where people get really confused once you get to this step. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, we've done our 5 supers. We've built up the 20, the 40, the 60, the 80, the 100%. That is totally built up now. We talked about this. That does not reset each turn. That says once it's performed, it's up. That is up now. So we're going to take 329,852. We're going to multiply that by 2. So that's what we would see. We would open up our phones on, let's say, turn 3 or on turn 5 once that's fully built up. I guess turn 5, right? Like, you can't get it all fully built up in one turn, I believe. You'd have to, I believe it'd have to be on turn 5. So let's say we open up our phones on turn 5, and we see Piccolo Jr. has a defense stat of 659,705, and we go, whoa! We're doing really well this turn, right? Because we're going to get 100% defense whenever we put him in slot 2 or 3. He's going to do that super attack, and we're going to get that 100%, right? Boom, right here. Plus an additional 100% attacking defense when performing a super attack. All right, he's got 659,705. We multiply that by 2. No. That's not what we do, is it? Because what did we just do? We just multiplied within the same phase, right? We don't do that. We just multiplied a phase 2 against a phase 2. We don't do that. No. So what do? There's 2 ways you can approach this. Again, the first way that I told you is you divide out. You get rid of it. You divide out the 100%. We know that's phase 2. We got to get that out of there. We got to get all of our phase 2 buffs out. So now we're just back down to our phase 1 buff, right? And that's why this number is the same. We're back. That is our phase 1 buff. So another way to think about it is to say, okay, we're going to start at our phase 1 buff. We know that we have 100% activated. We know that. We know that. We know we're going to multiply by 2. But we're going to get another 100% added in there, right? So what's that's going to be? Our total phase 2 buff and our passive is going to be 100%. We know that's already activated. Plus the other 100% that we're going to get. 100% plus 100% is 200%. We add in our base to include the 329. We're going to multiply by 3. So his defense before his super attack effect or anything else like that is 989,557. That's what it would go up to. Again, we don't multiply this by 2. We don't do that. No. Right? Because that's multiplying within the same phase. Right? And so now we are overstating our defense by 329,000, right? We are overstating our defense. We don't want to do that. We don't want to overstate, all right? We don't inflate the value of our assets here, okay? We state it correctly. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take this number right here, our phase 1 number, and we're going to multiply it by our total phase 2 buffs. Again, another way to think about that is we take our phase 2 buff that's already activated, we get rid of it. We divide by 2, okay? I'm going to put it in parentheses just so that we have our order of operations going correctly here. And we say, okay, we're back down to phase 1 now. We've got our 329, 852. We're back at where we started. We know that we have 100% buff activated. We're going to get 100% buff. We just can't see it. Add together 200% at our base, 3, 989, 557. It's the same thing. Okay. So just want to get that out there. That's a pretty good example. Piccolo Jr. is a pretty good example for that. So just wanted to kind of get that out there. I guess we could just go ahead and leave it. I take this, multiply by 3. We can just leave that there for now. We can keep using Piccolo Jr. as an example. He's a pretty good unit, so we'll just keep doing this. So again, yeah, don't forget your base. Don't forget that. All right, so hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense. I know I probably went a little bit fast and furious through that. Sorry. Again, we're a minute 18 into here. I hope I'm explaining this decently well. Again, we'll like pull up a video at the end. I'll go to like a random truth video. We'll pick a unit and we'll calculate where that defense number is coming from or something like that. Or maybe I'll use my own video. Who knows? The next step is step 6. This is going to be your super attack effect buffs. So I wanted to kind of go over your common multipliers here. So we got raises defense. That's typically a 30% stack. You got to be a little bit careful with how these things are worded. If you're ever unsure, and I kind of say this down at the bottom, but yeah, utilize Dokkan info. If you're ever unsure what a buff is, again, you just go to Dokkan info. It's going to tell you right here. And Harry Turney always does a really good job of like wording these in ways that make sense to the player, right? Harry Turney does a little bit better job, just like for example, what's a good unit that I could show you guys? All right, this UI Goku is a really good example. So we have raises attack, greatly raises defense for 1 turn, raises all allies attack by 30% for 1 turn. So what this means, right? We infinitely stack attack 30%. We greatly raise defense for 1 turn 50%. We raise all allies attack by 30% for 1 turn 30%. So if you're ever confused, you see how it's 3 separate lines. So we know this one's stacking because it doesn't say for 1 turn or 2 turns, 3 turns, etc. It just, we raise attack. It's a permanent buff. It's 30%. We can see it right there. Our defense raises greatly raises defense for 1 turn, right? Greatly raises defense is typically a 50% raise. It's for 1 turn. It's limited right there. We can see it on the same line. And then again, we see raises allies attack by 30% for 1 turn. We can see the specific limitation. We can see the buff that we receive. It's really easy to denote a difference like that. Whereas sometimes in game, it can be a little bit more ambiguous. You know, it's not always clear just whenever they drop info sometimes what exactly is going on with the buffs. So you got to take special care. And sometimes it's worth waiting for the data downloads to exactly see how something is written, how it's worded, how it shows up in the database. Than to make assumptions before a unit drops. You know, so some people get a little bit carried away with like, oh, this unit stacks, this unit doesn't. So again, just like raises defense is a 30% stack. Raises defense for 1 turn is just 30% for 1 turn. Greatly raises defense is a 50% stack. Greatly raises defense for 1 turn is a 50% raise for 1 turn. Now, a common one that you'll see is raises attack and defense. If you have a infinite stack of both attack and defense, that is typically a 20% stack. I believe we saw that most recently with, was it Int Broly, maybe? I can't exactly remember the EZA Int Broly. Or maybe Tech Vegeta or God Goku. Physical God Goku for sure has that. So if you see raises attack and defense and it's an infinite stack like that, it's typically 20%, which is not very good. But anyway, raises attack and defense for 1 turn, 30%. And again, utilize Dokkan info if you were ever unsure. The way it's worded on there is always really easy to like digest and figure out what is for 1 turn and what's, you know, infinite. Again, these are... Well, I said these are also the most common point when calculating these effects. Or, well, I said stacking buffs are the most common error when calculating these effects. So again, just like multiplicative buffs, you know, people will see, like, oh, our defense is, I don't know, let's go back to our Piccolo Jr. example just real quick. So let's say that hypothetically, this isn't real, but let's say hypothetically Piccolo Jr. stacks 30% defense on his super attack effect. So you would take this right here, multiply by 1.3, and we're going to be at 1.286424 defense on our next turn. Well, actually, we would see this times 1.3. But anyway, so we would see 857, 616, right? And so most people are going to look at that and go, oh, we're just going to get, like even if you did this correctly, because because what do we have to do, folks? If we see 857, 616 at the start of turn, we know that we get the 100% on super attack in slots 2 or 3, right? And then we know that we're going to get another 30% stack in. Well, what do we know? 857, 616. Well, we just discussed this, right? Well, we got to get rid of that extra 100% buff. So, boom, we divide by 2, right? We got to get rid of that 100% buff. We just talked about that, right? And then, all right, so we got rid of that, and we're going to multiply by 2, okay? Or, I'm sorry. We're going to multiply by 3, right? Which is going to get us back, you see, to the 1286424. That gets us right back to this number. And then people are going to go, okay, boom. We took out, we took out our passive phase 2 buff that was already activated. We added in our other one. We added in our base, so now we're up to 1.286. And we're going to multiply by 1.3 again. Boom, so we're going to be up to 1. No, see, we don't do that. No. I'm kind of like I'm kind of blurring the lines here, so I'm making this a bad example. But like most people are going to see this, and what are we doing wrong here? All right, because we're dividing out our 100%. We're taking this out. We know this is already activated, so we're taking it out. We feel like we're doing that correctly. We're adding these two together within the same phase. We're getting to 200%. We got the base, right? So we got our 3, and now we're multiplying it by our 1.3 stacking buff again. Oh, that's our issue. That's our issue, right? We already have a 30% buff included here. We're multiplying within the same phase again. This 857, 616 right here already includes a 30% buff from the previous turn. So not only do we have to divide out, our passive buffs, now we got to divide out the other super attack buff. That gets us back to the 989, 557. And this is where calcs just start getting off the walls a little bit. And again, this isn't a great example just because, we're starting to talk about more complicated things. But this is the stuff you have to think about. It's like we can't multiply within the same phase. We've got to get out the 100%, right, that we're already including here. And now we've got to get out the 1.3 that we're already including here. We can't double count that. And so now we have to multiply by 1.6 because we already have a 30% buff activated. We're going to get another 30% buff on this turn. So our defense is going to go up to 1.583 million instead. Again, I know that sounds just like I probably lost a bunch of you right there. But just to kind of recap, right, we already discussed this part. Like this part we already discussed. This little highlighted section up here. We're taking our number, we're taking out the 100% buff that's already activated it, we're adding it to the other 100% buff that's going to become activated for a total of a 200% boost in passive phase 2. But we now have to also remove our super attack effect because we can't multiply in the same phase. We can't multiply a 1.3 by a 1.3. So we got to pull that 1.3 out. We have to add 30% to it because now we're getting a new stack on this turn. So that's why it goes from 1.3 to 1.6. And so after we've pulled out that 1.3, now we can multiply by 1.6 again, which is the base plus 30% from our first super attack plus 30% from our second super attack. So that's why people can get really confused with stacking buffs is because, again, you don't realize that it's already in there. Like, people forget that it's already included in your current number that you're seeing. They just see what they see at the start of turn, and they start going, oh, we're just going to get another 30% of that. And you start compounding it. But we're not compounding. We don't multiply within the same phase. We only add within the same phase. Our super attack effect as we're stacking is we're going to go 30% to 60 to 90 to 120 to 150 to 180, etc., right? We're not going to compound it. We don't want to take, something that's already there and just make it higher. So, I know that's probably, again, convoluted, and this is getting a little bit more complex than what we're talking about, but I just wanted you guys to have kind of a basis for what's going on. So I know I called this a simple guide to calculating defense, but it does get out of hand a little bit quickly, and not every unit's super hard. I just talked about the other day, we were just talking about, like, for example, this, like the Super Saiyan 2 Vegeta and the Super Saiyan 3 Goku or whatever, right? Like we were just talking about these units, and they're not super difficult. There's nothing insanely crazy going on with them, right? Let me zoom this out just a little bit so you guys can actually see. Why is it like cut off weird? Hang on. There we go. Now you guys can actually see it. Right, so we've got our defense stat. We multiply by 5 for our 200% leader. We multiply that by 1.05 for our links. The next thing that we have is our defense in passive phase 1, which, if you guys remember, on the Super Saiyan 2 Vegeta was 150% if we're at max HP, right? If we look right here, right, like we said, we got our defense stat, 14,060. We're multiplying by 5 because we're going to assume that we're on a 200% leader. Again, we can look that up by clicking on this button right here, not the Majin Vegeta button, but these right here, and we can see, okay, we've got several 200% options. We got several modern 200% options, so it shouldn't be super difficult to find a team for him. Okay, oops. Our next step is links. We're going to scroll down here and take a look at his links, and we can see, okay, Saiyan Warrior Race is attack, Super Saiyan is attack, Saiyan Pride is attack, Royal Lineage is attack. Oh, Prepared for Battle, there we go, 5% defense. Supreme Power, oh, there we go, 10% defense if we wanted it to be, right? Like we could get another 10% defense right there. So if we wanted to, we could make this 15. For ease of use, we're just going to make it 5. And then Fierce Battle is just attack. So again, so we just take this number right here, multiply by 1.05, and that gets us our buff from our links. And then we get 150% in passive phase 1. We already looked at it, right? 150% passive phase 1 right here. That's just damage reduction. We don't worry about that. That's just attack. We don't worry about that. We do, this is also passive phase 1 right here. Additional defense boost by up to 120%. The less HP remaining, the greater the boost. But it's the less HP remaining. Let's just assume for simplicity, for easiness, that we're at 100% HP. So we're not getting any of this activated right here. So all we have in passive phase 1 is this 150%. And then you can just kind of skim here and notice that there's nothing else right here that's really talking about attack and defense, right? So then we go back to our calc. And then we see 120% in phase 2 with 3 orbs, right? So right here, attack and defense plus 120% when attacking with 3 or more key spheres obtained. So if we get 3 key spheres and attack, then we get this 120%, and that's passive phase 2, because again, we're performing an action to get it to happen. So right here, that's multiplicative. So right here, right, the 184, that's the 73,815 multiplied by 2.5, right? Because we had 150% in passive phase 1, and then we know we multiply the different buckets. So passive phase 2 is 120%. So we take the 184, 538, multiply by 2.2. And then our last phase, the one that we just talked about, was our super attack, right? So we go look up here at Vegeta, raises attack and defense for 1 turn. This is where we also kind of have to skim the passive. We have to say, okay, how many super attacks can Vegeta do? Vegeta can do 1. Every unit, unless they're sealed or they don't get enough ki, can do 1 super attack. You get that naturally. Vegeta right here, if HP is 50% or more, great chance of launching an additional super attack. So that means he can do 2, right? Which means, you can do a minimum of 2, and then you'll have your hidden potential system. So as long as you have an additional equip on him, or he's rainbowed, and you've got some additional on him in the hidden potential system, right, you'll be able to get an additional super attack with this guy, right? Which means you can do a total of 3. You got his natural one, you got his passive one, and then you've got his hidden potential. So we can do a maximum of 3. That means that he can proc this 30% 3 times. And again, that's within the same phase. So you're going to go 30, 60, 90. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate right here. So we get 30% on super. We get 60% on a double, 90% on a triple. Now I want you to notice, it's a little bit hard to see right here. Let me see if I can zoom in for you guys just a little bit. It didn't really make it clearer, but you can see right here. A307s. That's A307. That's passive phase 2, right? And we're multiplying it by 1.3. Again, that's the base plus the 30% buff that we get on super. The next one, also A307, because that's passive phase 2. We didn't move to A308, right? Because that would be multiplying within the same phase. We add within the same phase, right? So that's why it's times 1.6, multiplied by 1.6. A307, passive phase 2, multiplied by 1.6 for a double super, because that's the base plus 30% for the first super, 30% for the second super. Oops. Hang on. My bad. Hang on. Oh no, give me just a second. We're off in Neverland. There we go. Sorry about that. And then finally, again, if we happen to triple super, again, A307, passive phase 2, multiplied by 1.9, 30% for the first super, 30% for the second super, 30% for the third super, added together is 0.3, 0.3, 0.3 is 0.9, add the base of 1, and you get 1.9. So that's where that comes in. And then again, talking about support, right? We were talking about normal support, so whenever I was talking about that, you see how in phase 1 right here, this one is just 150%, and this one right here is 190%. That's because most support goes into this phase right here, right? This is your most common support. So whereas you see multiplied by 2.5 on this side, right here you see 2.9. Because it's the 150% plus the base, that gets you 2.5, and then you add in the additional 40%, which is 0.4, which gets you to 2.9. So you always have the base plus 1.5 plus 0.4. So that's where that comes in. Now, again, we are talking about the super attack phase, and I did kind of mention this earlier. More and more units are starting to get support buffs when performing a super attack. We were just kind of looking at Tech UI Goku earlier, just as an example. I don't know the fastest way to get back there. All right, this is a good example right here. The Reps Universe 7, right? So they give, on their 18 key, the Ultra Super Attack, that's their 18 key super attack, raises allies' attack and defense by 30% for 2 turns. So again, that would go right here into the same phase as this, right? So we wouldn't just take this number and multiply by 1.3. You would actually want to add like a 4th line down here and say 120% with like triple plus 30%, like MVP 17. I know this is a lot of words. 2-turn SA effect, right? So I know that's a lot of words right there, but you would add that 30% into this same phase because this is the same bucket. It's in the same section. It's on super attack. It's on the super attack effect. So if you had that 30% buff up, which these two aren't on the same team together. I'm just using this as an example, but it would essentially be like doing a quadruple super. Instead of, you wouldn't take this and multiply it by 1.3. You would again take the A307, and instead of 1.9, you would multiply by 2.2, right? Because it'd be this multiplied by, be multiplied by 1, which is for the base, plus 0.3 for the first super attack, plus 0.3 for the second super attack, plus 0.3 for the third super attack, and then plus 0.3 for the Reps Universe 7 MVP 17 support, which is going to get you a total of, 1 plus 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, 0.3 is 2.2. And so that gets you 893, 162. So that's what's happening right there. This would go into the same phase. Just like I mentioned earlier, the Battle of Gods Vegeta. His support, I think I was pretty close to him earlier. Let me see if I can just back up and go to him. Maybe not. Maybe I wasn't as close as I thought I was. Oh no, I'm so sorry, guys. I thought I was just like right next to him a second ago. Maybe he was on here. Oh no. Yes, right here. Perfect. Okay. It's like, whereas this guy right here, right? You see this? All allies attacking defense plus 30% after the character receives an attack 3 or more times in battle. After he receives an attack, right? 3 or more times. That's going to be passive phase 2. So that would go into this phase. And so instead of 120%, this would be 150. So instead of 2.2, this would be 2.5. Try hide rows. Got it. Thanks. So it's important that you're making sure that your support is going into the correct phase. Again, most support is going to go into phase 1. If you have a character like Battle of Gods Vegeta, where he's giving support on attack or after receiving an attack, that's going to go into passive phase 2. If you have a character like MVP 17, who gives support on his super attack effect, that's going to go into your super attack effect bucket. And again, you don't want to multiply within your own buckets. You want to make sure you're adding within the buckets. So just don't make that mistake. That's just something I really want to drill home with you guys. So yeah, we talked about all this. The last two things are the active skill buffs. So again, these are often referred to as true buffs. You basically just take what you see right here. You know, and if we had an active skill of 30%, oops, I hit caps lock. If we had an active skill, right, of 30%, this is going to be its own bucket. And so you would just take this right here, or whatever, however many super attacks you got, and you would just multiply by 1.3. That's easy. Active skills are they're their own bucket, they're their own thing. It just multiplies on like it would anything else. So that's why those are considered true buffs. Exact same thing with domains. Domains are also their own phase. So if you got another one of 30%, you would take this, multiply it by 1.3. They're their own phase. They're their own bucket. They multiply against the other buckets, add within themselves. So that's how you would take care of that. So that's kind of your last two slides are on domains and active skills. So again, these are often referred to as true buffs. Whenever people say like, oh, that's a true 30% buff. And you can see it. You know, if you have a character that gets, you know, attack and defense on their active skill, you can see it. You can pop it, and if the enemy survives, or if it's just a buff or whatever, you can see your stats go up. If you have 100,000 defense and your character gets 50% defense on their active skill, you're going to pop it, and it's going to go up to 150,000. You can see that. You can calculate it. You can, you know, feel it within your bones, right? Again, you calculate it in their own phase, so you just simply add an additional multiplier. And like I said here, 100,000, active skill buff at 30%, multiplied by 1.3, that's 130%. One nice thing about active skill buffs is that whenever you use an active skill, it typically activates your on super attack buffs. It gets those activated as soon as you use it. So a character like Piccolo Jr., for example, we were talking about how he gets 20% attack and defense with like each super attack performed. So if, you know, you're going up against an enemy, you pop his active skill, it's going to proc that 20% buff. And if there's multiple enemies, it'll actually proc it multiple times. So if you're going up against, 3 enemies or 4 enemies, if you're up against like that Super Saiyan Goku Supreme Magnificent Battle or Movie Memorial, where, you go up against like the Piccolo, the Gohan, the Trunks, and the Vegeta. If you were to pop Piccolo Jr.'s active skill in there, well, there's like 4 enemies or whatever that you're fighting, maybe 5, I can't remember. And so it would actually activate that 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, and you'd have that full 100% activated as soon as you pop the active skill. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Another common one is like Physical Ultimate Gohan. He gets super effective against all types at 24 key, and he gets like additional attack that has a 70% chance of being a super attack at like 20 key, I believe. And so if you pop his active skill, because it counts as you hitting your maximum key for that turn, it'll also activate those effects. So I just wanted to kind of mention that is a really nice effect about active skills, is it has the ability to proc those other effects, like before you actually like lock in the turn, like when they would normally be activated. So you can actually sometimes see some of those buffs that you wouldn't normally see activated at the start of turn. You'll actually be able to get those, and it can make some characters, for example, like better in slot 1, and different things like that. Like Int Fat Boo's a really good example. where it'll activate like his extra 150% that he gets on super attack. And so it'll kind of multiply in with like all of his stacks and everything like that. And it'll make his start of turn defense like way more potent than what it normally is. So that's like a really good effect for like Int Fat Boo, for example. And then the domain slide basically says the exact same thing. Basically, you know, you guys can read that one on your own. I guess I'm not centered anymore. I apologize. There we go. But you guys can read this slide. Again, essentially the same thing as active skills, except it doesn't have that extra little special effect of activating your like passive phase 2 buffs. So nothing really to go over there. Last thing, it's kind of just like I put step 8. This is actually step 9, or really just continuing steps. It is just try to calc things on your own. You know, start by calculating and trying to match your own units. Then maybe pull up like a Dokkan YouTuber's video, look at a defense of a character and try to calculate it on your own, which is what we're about to do. Ask questions if you're going through a video or if you're using a unit and you're like, hey, my unit has this much defense. I'm not sure like how it's getting there. It has these links activated. It's got like this much support or something like that. Or I've got these characters on the team. It's next to these two. You know, can you help me kind of figure out how we're getting to that number? You know, sometimes it can be a little bit hard because you got to describe like the whole situation. It's like, okay, this character super attacked last turn. This character's on the team, right? It can get a little bit cumbersome, but you know, ask questions if there's ever anything that you don't understand, if you're getting caught up somewhere, if you're not quite matching other people's numbers, you know, ask questions. And then I would say your final step, and kind of like a continuing education is what I would kind of call it, is learn how to calculate how damage taken works. So once you figure out, you know, how much defense you have, we know how hard bosses hit, right? Because we have the data on like Dokkan info and things like that. So then start trying to figure out, okay, how much damage am I going to take from this super attack, and really start advancing your game and learning how to do things better. So again, thank you guys for sticking around for this really long video. I'm going to pull up another video right now, and we're just going to pick a random defense stat, and we're going to kind of calculate or back into it. So give me just a second, and I will get that pulled up, and we'll discuss it. All right, so here we go. This is kind of in like bad quality. Hang on, sorry, 1 second. All right, so here we go. That it's a little bit clearer, but so Majin Vegeta on this turn right here is at 278, 388. All right, so that's our target number. So let's go back over here. We can kind of look at my calcs a little bit and cheat, but let's not do that. Hang on 1 second. All right, so we know that he is using this Tech Majin Vegeta right here, and we know that he's transformed. If we go back and look at the video again, we can see that he's transformed. Again, sorry it's in like low quality. I don't know why it's showing up like that on OBS, but it's at 278, 388 is what his defense stat is at. So we're just going to type this over here, 278, 388. That's our target, so that's what we're shooting for. We know Tech Majin Vegeta has a defense stat of 14,060. Truth's using him on the private server. Of course, he's rainbowed. We know who we're dealing with right here. He's on a 200% leader skill. We saw he's using that AGL Vegeta, the Namek Vegeta. So if we click on our 200% leaders right here, we can see this guy right here. That's who he's using as his leader. We can see right there, guest and leader. So we know that Vegeta's on a 200% leader. So we're going to take that and multiply it by 5. Now for links, we need to look at who he's linked next to right here. And we can see he's linked next to STR Broly. Now, what we know, or, well, you'd have to look this up on your own, but STR Broly actually does not share any defense links with this Vegeta. This Vegeta only has Supreme Power. We can look at this, and STR Broly is not going to have Supreme Power down here. This is pretty much just a Majin Buu Saga link. So we know that Vegeta does not have any defensive links activated. So for links, we're just going to kind of ignore that phase, and we're just going to ignore it. We don't have any links activated. We can just skip that phase. If you wanted, you could say links, you know, 0%, right? And you wouldn't multiply by 0% because you got to include the base. So you got to multiply by 1, right? Because it'd just be 1 plus 0. So we're just stuck at 70,300. So now this is where things get a little bit tricky with this Vegeta because he's got an HP condition. Now you can't really see it. But if I back up a little bit, you can see he's below 50% HP right here. So we're going to have to kind of make a little bit of we're going to have to kind of work into it a little bit here. Let me go back. Well, ooh, sorry. I don't know if you guys heard that. That was really loud for me. But we know that we're shooting for 278, 388 at the start of turn right here. So what do we know? What do we know about this Vegeta? So if I go back, we know he gets 200% at the start of turn. So we know phase 1 for sure he's getting at least 200%. So if we take 70,300 and we multiply by 3, well, we're off a little bit, right? We're off about, what is that? About 68,000 is that we're off by. Now, this is where we got to look at his passive right here. Plus an additional defense boost of 150%. The less HP remaining, the greater the boost. So this is a little bit tricky on how we're going to get to this. So I would say this is a situation where you kind of have to just back into it to determine how much of this is activated right here. I'm sure you could do this like a harder way, but I'm going to say the easiest way to do it is say, okay, we know before any other buff is activated, right? Because we don't have support as far as I remember. Let me double check that STR Broly and Int Go Tanks, but I'm pretty sure. All right, so just looking at this Int Go Tanks right here, you know, we don't see any support. We don't see any support in here, anything like that. So we know that we're in the clear there. Just looking at the rest of the team, right? You know, there's no other like 2-turn support units on there. And then again, STR Broly is the only one I'm not 100% certain about because I know he does give support, but I thought it was only with rainbow orbs. Yeah, so Broly does give support right here. He gives super class allies ki +1 and attack +10%, and extreme class allies ki +1 attack and defense +20% per rainbow key sphere obtained. He hasn't collected any orbs yet on the turn, so we do not have any of this support activated. I guess specifically it'd be this part right here. We do not have any of that activated at the moment. So what do we know? We know that we have the 200%, right? But we know that there's some other mysterious amount activated in here to get us up to 278. So I would say the easiest way to figure this out is to take the 278, 388, divide by the 70,300, and that's going to get us our multiplier. And let me expand the decimals just a little bit here. So we can see 3.96, right? So of which we know 2... hang on. Was this -2? I guess I need to, where's the format painter? There we go. So we know of which 2, right, is related to the 200% right here. We know that 1 is related to our base, and so that means that we're getting an additional 96% activated from the, what is it, 150% that Vegeta gets? How far back do I have to go to get to Vegeta? Hang on. There we go. So yeah, we know that we're getting 96% of this 150 activated right here. So if I was just to take, you know, equals 96 divided by 150, that gets us to about 64% right there. So that would mean that we have, like, what, 36% HP or something like that? So you can see, what, 10, 20, 30, 40. I mean, it's not exact, but you can see we're at some, like, low HP right there. The HP as defense gets lower, I'm not 100% exactly certain how it's calculated, but essentially we're getting 96%. So really, our passive phase 1 buff right here is 296. So we're going to take 70,300 multiply by 3.96. And again, we just had to kind of back into that. Whenever you have these HP conditions, that's why it gets a little bit complicated. You can't perfectly predict it. And that's why I was saying it's easier to figure out whenever you're just at 100% HP for this like Majin Vegeta. And it's probably not the best example I could have picked. But, you know, we did have to kind of back into that. But it does make sense. It's like we're low HP, so we know that at bare minimum, we should be getting 200%. And we know that our HP is low, so we should be getting some level of this 150%. So we know that we're getting 96% right now. You know, that's roughly what we would expect to see, you know, from being at a low HP. We'd expect maybe at like 50%, we'd be 75%. We're lower than 50% at this point, so seeing an extra like 20% pop in there, it's, you know, it's relative, right? Like we can kind of say that within a reasonableness test, some people call it a sniff test, right? So we know that that's about right. Now, Truth on this turn does get 6 orbs. So we're going to get this 130% when attacking and this 66% when attacking. He's also going to get rainbow orbs with Broly, so that's going to cause our stats to go up. So we can actually look at that right here. Let me mute him so that I stop getting my ears blown out. So we can see 278, 388, right? And he's going to blab on for like half an hour like he does. All right, buddy. You want to get there? Okay, so he's going to get the 6 orbs. Now, notice his stats are not going to change, right? He's going to get these 6 orbs right here. And he's still at 278, 388 because he hasn't attacked yet. Now, he's going to get 3 rainbow orbs right here with Broly, right? So he's going to get 3 rainbow orbs. We just read that Broly gives 20% defense support per rainbow key sphere obtained to extreme class allies. So we know that we're going to get an additional 60% right here. We know that from the support that we're going to get an extra 60%. So what are we going to do? We're going to take our number right here and we're going to add plus 0.6 because we know it goes into this phase. We know that that's part of our, start of turn defensive buffs. And so we should go up to 320, 586. So if we go back over here, he's going to collect these orbs. Let's go ahead and collect these. All right, we get that buff. And boom, 320, 568. 320, 568. Right on the mark. There we go. That's how you know that we're doing this correctly. Again, we kind of had to back into the 296, but you guys can see that I know a little bit about what I'm talking about because we matched it perfectly. 325, 68 after we added in the 60% support. So again, this is the base of 1 and then the 296%. So that's where we're getting our 3.96, and then we're adding in our 60% support right there. We're adding within our phase. We're not multiplying within our phase, right? He got 6 orbs, so we can't actually see this now, but we know passive phase 2, he's going to get, with 6 orbs, 130% for 3, and then an additional 66% with 6. These are in the same phase. We add within the same phase, so we're going to have 130% plus 66% in the same phase. What is that? That's 196% at our base. So we're going to take this and multiply by 2.96, right? Because that's 196 plus 1 is 2.96. So we're going to be at 948. So now let's see how many super attacks he gets. He's going to blabber on. He's going to be like, I don't know about this modern video, blah, 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 blah. All right, so here we go. So we're guarding, whatever. All right, 22 million. So that's 1 super attack. Here's 1. All right. Here we go. And boom. All right, so he only did 1. He did 1 super attack right there. Pretty lucky. So we know that he gets how much defense on super attack? 50%. Greatly raises attack and defense. Greatly raises a 50% raise. And so we know we get 50% on super. And so we're going to take this right here and multiply it by 1.5. What if he had gotten a double? How much would he get? 100%. That's right. 100% on super. Hopefully you guys said the right number. If not, I'm very sad. Which number are we going to multiply? Are we going to multiply this by 100%? Or are we going to multiply this by 100% plus the base? Which one is it going to be? That's right. It's this one right here. Then what are we going to multiply by? 2, right? Because it's a 50% increase over this one, and it's 100% plus our base of 1. What if you had gotten a triple super? What would we do? 150%. That's right. Right? And which one are we going to do? Are we going to do this one? We're going to do this one? That's right. We're going to do this one. And what are we going to multiply by? 2.5. Boom. So there we go. So if he got a single, so that's what his defense should have been at. With guard and his, 66% damage reduction? Pretty good. If he had gotten a double, this is what his defense stat would have been. If he had gotten a triple, that's what his defense stat would have been. So let me know what you guys think. Again, sorry this was such a long video. I started this out with as a simple guide, but there's a lot to cover whenever you're talking about defense, and this is almost like a full college lecture, so if anybody wants to be nice and kind of add timestamps in the comments for all the different sections, I would really appreciate that. I should probably do it myself, but it is 11 o'clock and I got to go to work tomorrow. So I really appreciate you guys watching. Again, thank you all so much for your support. Again, sorry this is such a long video, but hopefully you guys found it useful. Again, I don't want to draw this out because we're already 2 hours into this video, but at this point we're 2 hours in, so, who cares? The retention on this video is going to be abysmal, but Point being, guys, thank you again. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you learned something here. Again, practice on your own. Try to get to the numbers that you see in-game. Hopefully one day they let us actually see defense stats after we super attack, so that you guys can get some confirmation for where I'm pulling these numbers from. Because, like, right now, you guys, like, from this point on, it's kind of like a trust me, bro scenario, right? Whereas, you know, we can actually see this number. So you guys can trust me up to here, right? Like, you can trust me as far as here, but I know we're kind of getting into the source trust me, right? But anyway, thank you guys again. Hope you guys find this useful, and I'll catch you all next time.